Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arline Sachs, and this is Sally Sack. And today we're going to talk about some things that we've talked about before and some other things as well. And I guess what got us started is this marvelous new book that was just published that SALLYANN is one of the editors of.
Right.
And that's, what's the full name of it?
The Avotaynu Guide to Jewish Genealogy.
And it's got in there just about everything from the very, very beginnings to the very most advanced. You had over 60 authors.
Right.
So,
including you, Arline.
Yes, so we have experts in every single field. It's not like one person sitting down and writing what they know. And I guess let's start with a beginner genealogist. First thing they'll do is interview their family. I mean, that's what they're always told.
Right.
And look up birth and death records. But pretty soon, as Jews, we find we can't necessarily find the things that other people can. And so I guess that's where you're...
Well, that's where this comes in, actually. It really touches on the question of why we have something called Jewish genealogy as something special.
After all, we all have parents and grandparents.
Right.
Why are our parents and grandparents harder to find?
There's a couple of reasons. One is that most Jews today don't live where their ancestors lived 150 years ago. So we live here in the United States, but after and for the first couple of generations, we can follow the same path that your neighbor who isn't Jewish can follow, tracing their route, more or less. But then we have to go overseas. And then it's a whole different ball game.
You said 150 years, and that's really stretching it to the limit. Most of us had parents or grandparents that came.
Right.
So
well,
we're overseas very
right.
early.
The biggest Jewish migration to the United States took place between 1880 and 1920, and the first decade of the 20th century was absolutely the biggest. So yes,
it
was my grandparents who were all immigrants. And there are facts of Jewish life, of Jewish culture, the Jewish religion, Jewish history, that are unique to Jews, and you have to understand these in order to really be able to trace. And that's why in the early days, when we first started doing Jewish genealogy, people would say, what should I do?
Yeah.
And I would say, buy the Rottenberg and the Kurzweil books. Those were the beginnings.
Were the best at that time, but I certainly wouldn't recommend them much anymore.
No, and then
they're not bad. But
and then it became later join a Jewish genealogy society, because we began to form those because we realized we couldn't go to our county genealogy society when they told us to look in the family Bible. It wasn't us. So then it was, and subscribe to Avotaynu.
But the family Bible, again, is we found it
in your family. But most Jews who showed up at Ellis Island were not clutching Bibles. Let me tell you, they were running for their lives over the woods. And then in the mid-90s, it was go on Jewish Gen, join a special interest group. And as you start telling newbies, beginners, what to do, they're glazing over.
Yeah, there's too much to possibly grasp.
So for years, I wanted to be able to write a book that I could hand it to somebody and say, here, do everything, read this and do everything it says. Now, unfortunately, it's 600 and some pages. We cut it down from 800 and some. But to use a favorite term of my co-editor, Gary Mokoto, I allege that it's a book, that it's a basic reference book that can be used by beginners or by advanced. And even though we will continue to discover new things that will be in addition, the basic research, I think, is really there.
Even some of the things that I wrote, and between the time you thought about starting it was at least
4 years at least, or more.
And you had hoped to have all the articles in within a year, and then you kept saying, well, it'll be out this summer, it'll be out next summer.
The outliers, we called them. Yes, the ones who still didn't get their articles in.
But yeah, it's a fantastic book to sit down and read. And
well,
when I don't have anything to do, I turn to a page which, has nothing to do with my own family background, but just because it's so interesting.
Well, I should explain maybe how it's organized.
Yeah, let's go look at the
I have
topics.
these flyers, and I must say, the cover was designed by this artist in France who I think is just wonderful and very clever. But these flyers that I give out whenever I get a chance to talk about the book, has a list on the inside of all the chapters. And you see...
You're starting with the essentials.
Well, we have 4 sections. Well, actually 5 if you count the appendixes and an introduction. But the essentials are the methodology, how to be a genealogist. And I think Eileen Polikoff has written probably the best chapter I've ever seen on that. We rewrote it many times. Then, of course, the interview that you mentioned.
That I mentioned.
But then you see, when you start with Jews, we have something called shtetl geography and holistic geography.
Well, that's as soon as we get overseas, because we get overseas so soon. And what in the world's a shtetl?
Well, what are the 2 pieces of information you have to have or you can't go overseas?
You need to know where they came from.
And
what their name was there.
Exactly.
And what the name was there. I didn't say what the name was.
Not here, because we all have these jokes about the name was changed at Ellis Island. It wasn't changed at Ellis Island, but names were changed. So we have chapters on how you find that town. And then we have something called Jewish naming practices.
Which, of course, are very different.
Yes, exactly. You know, and that's one of the key items in the interviewing. We say to somebody, who were you named after? Because Jews have a tradition, at least European Jews, Ashkenazic Jews, who are the Eastern or Central and Eastern European Jews, children are named for close deceased relatives, never living relatives.
And then, of course, the Sephardic, which you don't want to make it easy. The Sephardic name after living relatives.
Well, they name after grandparents, whether they're living or alive.
It's a certain pattern that they follow too. So if you understand that pattern, that helps.
Right, and of course this thing about family names, Jews didn't have last names until the rulers of Europe, or at least the Ashkenazic, forced us to, most didn't. And then we have a chapter on the Jewish religion, culture, and history, and some of the fine points of that you have to know about, like uncles can marry nieces, but aunts can't marry nephews, and first cousin marriage was considered a very good thing.
And in many societies, somebody was writing, or they were astounded that a first cousin married a first cousin, and they thought that was totally unbelievable, and yet we have a lot of that.
Well, you know, one of the things that you really have to do is you have to put yourself in the mindset of your ancestors. If we make the mistake of interpreting their behavior as if they were living today in this place, and you can't do that.
You have a very small society of people you're going to marry within your religion. You have to marry.
Well, but Abraham told his grandson to go marry a cousin.
Yeah.
It's been considered a meritorious thing, and uncle-niece marriage was meritorious also.
Well, Abraham sent to Haran for a wife for Isaac too.
Right,
so
exactly.
you're going way back.
Right, exactly. So it's always been considered, but then as things became known about genetics, and it was discovered that if you do this, you're going to become more of what you are, and if you have these little nasty recessive genes that we're prone to, this could be a problem. And so I'm not sure that it's outlawed in all the states in the United States. I don't know if any states have ever addressed the question of uncle-niece marriage.
Oh, uncle-niece, I don't know.
Do you know, when I was tracing my first book, I discovered that a relative of mine who lives in Kensington, Maryland, married his niece in the 1920s. He was a retired Army general. I called him many times. He kept hanging up on me. He wanted me to disappear. I got the information anyhow, eventually. But so this is the basic stuff. And then we have special topics that are definitely Jewish. Holocaust research. We recently had a program on that. The internet isn't definitely Jewish, but there are definitely Jewish sites on the internet. Modern Jewish migrations, very helpful in trying to figure out how your relatives got where and when.
Very often, when they first came here, they came with other people from their same town, or they went to a town where they knew someone, which would have been somebody. So if you have no idea at all where they came from, a good place to start is the others in that area.
Absolutely.
And again, you don't know that if you're just beginning. So that's the kind of thing.
My father was born in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and I came to know that, and Sheboygan, at the time he was born, had the biggest Jewish, percentage-wise, the biggest Jewish population in the United States.
Oh, really?
The percentage of Jews. And they all came from the same tiny little area in what is now northeastern Belarus.
Well, you know, somebody's making good there, and they write home, and, well, let's go there. So they have a goal.
You don't go without a connection. Even if you were going to move, girls graduating from college these days don't just pick a city and go. Usually they have a friend somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we have rabbinic genealogy.
That's
a whole book. It goes on forever. Then we put in things like cemetery research, which is what you did.
And one reason we can do that is because the Christian cemeteries are not necessarily forever, whereas Jewish cemeteries are forever. So that if they still exist, of course, if there's nobody to keep them up and nobody cares about them, they very often disappear. But
you have visited Prague, haven't you?
No, I haven't. But my son was just there, and he was astounded.
Oh my! There's a cemetery there that dates back to the year 1000. It's the Jews are buried in layers, I think. There, but.
My son went there on a business trip, and I said, if you've got a few hours off, be sure to go there. And he did. And he
unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's in Haifa, in Israel, next to the train station, is a cemetery that was described in a book by a Jewish traveler in the 13th century. It's still there. And in fact, the oldest cemetery in New York City in Manhattan is a Jewish cemetery. It's in Chinatown.
Yeah,
They've never moved it.
So anyway,
Yes. And also, the fact of the Jewish names comes back in this. The reason we're looking so hard for those tombstones.
You find the grandfather, you can spot it because it has a similar name, or
right.
Your name is Abraham, son of Isaac, and then you find the tombstone, Abraham, son of Isaac. You know you've got it.
Even before the Jews had last names, the name that was given to the boy at his Brit Milah, at his circumcision, is the official Hebrew, sacred name, and it shows up on the tombstone. So then we have compiled family histories and genealogies. We do U.S. research from the point of view of what's special for Jewish genealogists, plus also, and I must admit, people who aren't Jewish could learn a lot from the immigration, naturalization, vital records, and census records chapters.
Much of that is, of course, generic, but it pertains to us too. So.
Right, and then we have Jewish museums and societies and wills and probates and World War I records. All of this because you're still trying to find those two pieces of information.
Where they came from.
And if you don't have it, you don't go anywhere.
Oh, I've heard people tell me, and they won't listen to me after it. And I can't do it. I don't know where they came from.
The name was changed at LSI.
Yeah,
right.
Can't do anything. And they won't even try. But that's wrong.
And it's so interesting. Yours is German, and German is, I think, a whole different research. But for me, who grew up being told by her mother that we came from the old country, she didn't know where, and that it didn't matter because the Germans had killed everybody and there were no records and nothing could be learned. I'm back in the middle of the 1700s.
Well,
early 1700s in some cases, without last names. And I've got generation by generation. So it's really a kick to be able to do this.
My mother, too, she knew her mother's name, but that was all. And she says, all of that was gone. Hitler destroyed everything. And the very first genealogy meeting I went to, because I had nothing better to do, actually, and you gave a lecture, and afterwards you had a beginning the
little workshop,
and obviously I was caught, and that's over 20 years ago.
Well, when I know I wasn't paying attention to genealogies when I was a kid, but once in a while I would hear about family trees, and I was absolutely sure they were like Christmas trees. They were not anything that Jews had. And in this weird way, though we have a history that goes back 5,000 years, 5,765 years, it was like we had no roots until Rottenberg and Kurzweil published these books that just started this amazing movement, so to speak.
Jews throughout history have been very interested in their genealogy, and it was always important that a family, your child marries somebody with, I think the Yiddish word is yiches. That means a good family.
Right.
Rather than they're being rich right now, did they come from a good family, an honest family, and so on. And some of that got severed as they came here and they left so many of their own family that they had to shut themselves off from it, and I think that was the only way they could live.
Absolutely.
We can't talk about what was before.
It has been said more than once that the two major events in Jewish history of the past 100 years have been migration and Holocaust.
Yeah.
And the combination of those two, if it hadn't been for the Holocaust, we'd still have the letters going back and forth to the cousins who were left behind and so forth and so on. So then we got to the biggest part of this book, which is researching the country of ancestry. And we have every country in the world, virtually, where Jews have been known to live in the last 200 years. And we start out with some overview chapters because the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, we even have one on Inquisition records. And then we go from Algeria to former Yugoslavia, and wherever I couldn't find an expert, I made myself
you became the expert.
So I end up writing the chapter on the Jews of Tunisia. But my biggest thrill, and it was mixed, was this summer in Jerusalem at the conference. We had a lecture for the first time ever on the Jews of India, given by an Indian Jew.
And you found out what you wrote was right.
Yes, I wrote the chapter on India, and I went to that lecture with such trepidation because the book was about to come out. It was too late to change anything. And what if this guy was going to say
something totally different?
Totally different. And I was so relieved. You have no idea. Though I wish I had found him before I knocked myself out learning about the Jews of India. Though you know something funny, Arline? When I was a kid, I was a big library user, and there was a series called the Chinese Twins, the Japanese Twins, the Russian Twins. I read all the twin books on all the countries of the world. I always loved countries, so it's probably not unusual that I wrote on the Jews of Iraq and so on. And then we end up with, we have a chapter at the end, we call it an appendix, called Engaging Your Children in Family History Research, which I think is a very important thing to do. I have found that my children and grandchildren, though they get tired of listening to my boring stories, they come around and they ask me questions, or they refer their friends to me for help. And
my granddaughter is 3 years old. She saw this book I wrote on my great-great-grandfather, and she saw it in the Temple books, just a flyer about it, and she says, "That's my great-great-great-great-grandfather," in her little 3-year-old voice, and I didn't even know they had posted that flyer there.
This is an important thing.
As we get we find out about our own family. In this particular man, it's not so much about my family, although it happens to be, but that particular book is just about the Jews in the 1800s in Germany. And because he wrote such marvelous diaries that I was, through you again, able to get a hold of. Yeah, he just gave me some very important hints on how to get them and learn how to read them and so on. Because he wrote so much, he gave a very good picture of what Jews in that area lived like and what their life was like, and that's really what we become so much more interested in after a while.
Absolutely.
I mean, at first you want to just know the names,
right?
But then you've got to know more.
This is really what we're really doing is family history.
Yeah,
one person at a time, and it's very painstaking. And you know, when you write regular history, you can make a few mistakes of fact, and nobody cares that much. But in genealogy, we do. And even before. This book, though, there's a huge chapter on the Jews of Israel, on how to do research in Israel. I had done this book just on genealogy in Israel because Israel is so central to Jewish genealogy. And
well, I've got to say, going back to what happened this summer, you know, I always heard that the Central Archives of the History of the Jewish People is the full name of it, had a lot of things, particularly in German, although they have it from all over.
Right.
Okay, I'll go there. Well, I couldn't stop working there. I was so amazed at how much they had there. So, and there are many, many other resources, and that's just one example. There are many things, once you get into your country, that you have to look at the archives, and I think you've mentioned as many as possible. The thing that each country chapter has that I think is important is they each start with what the Brits call a potted history, a brief history of Jewish life in that country, and they all end with very extensive bibliographies, including contact information. Every resource that's mentioned in the book, in the bibliography, in the section at the end under addresses, the address is given for every single resource, their postal address, their email address, their website, their phone numbers and fax numbers. Took forever. Now, they may change, but usually they don't, the postal address doesn't change so much. And if the postal address changes, if you know that something like that exists in today's world with the web, there's got to be some way you can find them. I mean, maybe 50 years ago, if the post office didn't want to forward a letter, you were sort of lost. But if you have that much information on it, then one way or another,
right,
you'll be able to find them.
That was the key idea, was to get it in one spot where really you could. Do you know the book, The Source for the Source for American Genealogy, which has been around for quite a while, was really the prototype for this. We tried to do basically what those two authors did.
That book had a little tiny picture, and it was the first time that I really saw a decent picture of the German printed script, which I couldn't, printed letters, which I couldn't figure out at all, and the English letters. And I stared at that little thing, and I had it enlarged. Now if you go to any Mormon library, they'll have big handouts of it.
It's our first appendix, the alphabets, in German, Hebrew, Polish, Russian, and Yiddish, because those are the ones you need to, you carry the templates with you when you go to work on the records.
Because if you go to order microfilm, and Mormon Church has microfilm from many, many countries, which I'm sure you talk about there, you're sitting and looking at a document, and if you can't tell the letters, I mean, that's the first thing that you learn, is to learn the letters of that language.
Well, and not everybody does. And one of the things that...
It's easy enough to do. You sit there and letter by letter.
One of my favorite examples, you know, the Ellis Island database, which is so valuable, unfortunately, the people who keyed in the records were not familiar with these alphabets, so that the Latvian capital of Riga, in one of my family's arrival records, shows up as Piga. The R was seen as a P, and unfortunately, no Soundex will pick it up, because when the initial letter is wrong like that,
there's no way to find it then.
There's no way to find it. So
that's a shame that they didn't have, because anybody that's a little bit knowledgeable with cities and areas that people came from would immediately realize, well, that the letter must have faded, the ink must have faded on
something like that. Yes,
because it's got to be Riga. There is no
other possibility. So there are little tips. I don't know if it made it for this book. So, for example, for Ellis Island, you really want to go to www.stevemorris.org. He's managed to figure out most of it. He hasn't come up with a system for Piga when it's Riga.
Except if he did it exactly, if somebody types in Riga, I know we have to look at Piga. Right. But that would be an individual programming for one name.
There's one other thing we did for this book that, for Gary and me, it was kind of an inside joke. In days past, when Jewish books were going to be printed, they got advance subscriptions, and it was the money that people paid. They traveled around from town to town. Most of these books were rabbinic, scholarly books, and they'd get people to make contributions. And if you made a contribution, then when the book was printed, there was a list of subscribers. We use these lists now. They're called the pre-numeranten list. The pre-name list. Yeah. Well, we decided we would do that too. So in the back of this book,
you got the people that bought it before it was published.
The advanced subscriptions, yes. And
here, your list of advanced subscribers. There you go.
There you go. There's a whole big list, and so hopefully generations from now,
we'll use that.
Somebody will use that. And also, the rabbis tended to do a little mini genealogy at the beginning of the book. So we decided we would do a mini genealogy at the beginning of the book. There's our parents and our spouses and our children and grandchildren.
Nice. Well, that's good.
So we had a little fun doing it. It wasn't all drudgery, though. Wanting to do a book with 60-some authors, you were a pleasure to deal with, Arline. But well, you know, they came from all over the world.
Until you get to them, until you bug them, and I was so honored to be asked. That I did it right away. Except then you asked me later what I wrote, and meanwhile I had a different computer. I couldn't even go back to it. But
it was a huge job to do as a part-time, after work venture. But once it was, and there were times when I referred to it as the albatross, because I thought it was never going to appear.
Well, it was 3 years after you first announced that it's going to be out soon.
Well, I finished my portion by June of 2003. But it took Gary Mokotov a whole year to do the production of it, because I'm sure, I'll open Every book I've ever done, I open it up, and the first page my eye falls on, I see a mistake. So I'm sure I will open this and find a mistake, because it's just facts,
well, and when he
one after the other.
And when he sent me some things in a supposedly easy-to-read format, then I couldn't read it, and I said, I can't look at this because you haven't sent it to me. And so some of the things I never got to proofread a second time because it wasn't going through the electronic stages properly.
One of the nightmares of doing a reference book. You know, reference books and all our genealogy books we're so concerned about accuracy. And yet,
well, even when we were doing that one, it wouldn't go back, and my PDF format didn't look exactly like his, and it was screwing things up, and the word was dropped, or, you know, we think we've got everything down with the computerized stuff, but there's still glitches.
But you know, many years ago, when Gary and I collaborated for the first time on a book called Where Once We Walked, which is nothing but a gazetteer, line after line of you know, latitude and longitude, we were concerned that we were going to make mistakes. And this professor in Israel burst out laughing, and he said, that's what I love about you Americans. He said, you rush in and do things where others are afraid to go. He said, publish it. Later, others will find the mistakes and clean it up. So that's what we hope we've done here.
I think that's better than sitting on something forever and wanting it perfect, because at least, even if there's a small mistake, somebody can use it.
Well, that's
lots of people can use it.
Well, that's what we have found with Where Once We Walked, and so
you've published an
update, a revision of that. We sold out, and people kept asking for it. When eBay started selling it for $386 a copy, we decided we really had to redo it.
So the new one is out?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes, that one's been out for some time, and it continues to
be very popular. I know the Library of Congress was using that one, too.
Theirs was in shreds. Yeah.
they used it heavily, which is always nice to know that they're referenced.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, and I think we've talked a little bit about how to begin.
Right, and in case they didn't get it, there's the address.